Hey there, welcome to Open Floor. This is the podcast where your voice has a platform to be heard. Make sure to check out our website at openfloor.me/home and to also follow us on Instagram at openfloorpodcast. Now enjoy the episode. Welcome to the first ever episode of Open Floor. My name is Ali, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to host this podcast and to be able to provide a platform for anybody of any background to voice their ideas, opinions, and emotions to you, the listener. I hope that these episodes will be informative for you, the listener, as they have been for me as a host, and I hope you will embark with me on this journey to the pursuit of true justice and the pursuit of the true emotions of the citizens of the world. Now with that, on this episode, we're going to be discussing the recent events of the past 2 to 3 weeks. This includes the unfortunate death of George Floyd. This includes the police brutality. This includes the rioting, the peaceful protests, the looting, all the good and the bad that has happened in the past 2 to 3 weeks. Now, it might seem that this time has had more detrimental events happen than beneficial events, but I want to take this time and look at it in a way where it's a time where no matter who you are, no matter your gender, your race, your ethnicity, you're able to associate yourself with this movement that's happening. It's a time where millions of people all across the world are showing their support towards a change that has needed to happen for hundreds of years. It has even caused thousands of Americans and even thousands of other people all around the world to come out of their homes during this pandemic and to protest for change. It shows how we are capable of creating movements that can instigate some sort of change, whether it be now or in the future. On this episode, I interview two people. Both of them are friends of mine, one of whom is Klaus, who is from the United Kingdom and a student there, and the other, a Lexington High School sophomore named Aryan Narayan. I ask of their opinions, their emotions, and their ideas that have stemmed during this time, and I hope that my discussions with them will serve to be informative for you, the listener, as it has been for me, the host. And without further ado, let's go to my interview with Klaus. I'm here with Klaus, who's joining me from the UK. Hi, Klaus.
Hi.
Let's jump right into it. So you're no doubt aware of the recent death of George Floyd, which instigated a huge slew of protests to happen all over the U.S. And so my first question for you is, what are your emotions toward the protest and movements in the U.S. right now?
So I think emotions have been very stirred lately for everybody. Mostly because the video of George Floyd being murdered was so decisively murder. Unlike a lot of videos you see floating around on social media, which are, kind of their camera angle is a bit shoddy. Maybe there wasn't a body cam, or you don't see what happens before action starts happening. But this was it was a long video. It had a good angle. It was very decisive, and you had, police experts and martial arts experts saying, "Oh, that's a completely wrong choke. That's completely not what we do. We're supposed to be EMS as well as police officers." So I think it got everybody angry, including cops. And so I think the protests were very called for, and we have gotten justice where the guy who was on his neck, he's now being charged with second-degree murder, which is very severe degree of murder. And the other four that were involved, there was one other keeping civilians from helping, and then there was three other on George Floyd, along with the man on his neck. And so I think we have gotten that short-term justice, but I think people want more because they want to try to prevent things like this from happening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think most definitely, yeah. And so, kind of relating back to that, how have these protests affected you in general? Or because you don't live in the US, have the protests and movements here in the US instigated anything over in the UK?
Um, I know in London there are very big protests where you have famous celebrity John Boyega. He plays Finn in Star Wars, and he was out marching. I mean, he's always been very vocal on social media. You know, he criticized the Star Wars movies on social media,
Really?
and so he's a very open person, and um, those have been very peaceful. I haven't seen any rioting on the news in London, and there are protests here where I live, which is a medium-sized city in the UK, and but it's a very educated city. It's a very like middle class city. Yeah, there's lots of universities here, and so the protests aren't as like passionate, I'd say, but there are big ones in the parks and such.
Okay. Um, so kind of again relating back to that, right? So the entire basis of these protests has been in a response to police brutality over not just because of this most recent event, but also the events that have happened time and time before, happening in the same places too in the United States. And so, how do you think police brutality has evolved over time? Do you think we're getting to a place where us as a society, we have to accept that there are going to be these situations, or do you think that we're more deviating from that possibility of acceptance?
Um, I don't think you should ever accept when bad things happen. You should always strive to fight the bad stuff and get justice, but there's a sort of understanding you have to have where the amount of people there are in the US is just it's unbelievably unlikely that there won't be any unfortunate incidents. Uh, so and but I think that the police are more of a distraction from the bigger problem, and it's a problem that more affects the African American community, which is um like the prison system, which is so basically the war on drugs. There are recordings of the people in the Ronald Reagan administration saying that the war on drugs was a way to um to get hippies and black people in prison because the hippies were anti-war. They wanted to associate them with marijuana. They wanted to associate African Americans with marijuana and crack cocaine. And so they made marijuana and crack cocaine the worst possible drug you can do in the law when cocaine is chemically the exact same as crack cocaine and marijuana is it's less dangerous than alcohol, yet they class these so high just to get more black people in prison. And it started a really bad cycle uh, that increased gang violence and such. So I think that's the bigger problem uh, that people need to focus on.
Yeah, so I guess in a sense, then you think then we should be focusing our attention away from police brutality, and in a sense, we should be looking at our kind of reform system that we have in place, rather than focusing on the enforcement part of it, right? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Um, I'm saying that I think it's hard to show with a video how people are affected by every with so many by so many people being in prison, you know. But it's easy to show police brutality, and but that doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on it. Like even whenever there's 8,000 cops a year get arrested and charged with something, which isn't necessarily police brutality, but overall. And so I think people do deal with it, and I think a lot of cops do really not like it because it makes them look bad. and it makes the public trust them less. And when the public trusts them less, you get into more dangerous situations.
I see what you're saying. So now kind of shifting more onto what people have been doing in response to the recent events of the past 2 weeks, where you've seen, I'm sure you've seen on social media, where people have been posting about like their support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests that have been happening. And so they've been posting, for example, like the black squares for Blackout Tuesday. And so, how useful do you think are these things that people are doing on social media? Do you think that they have any significant effect, or are they just kind of words without promises, so to say?
I think that social media it's a great way to make a community, to combine communities. It's a great way to communicate things and to show people uh, the world. But like when some kid like posts like a black square, it's not really gonna do anything. I feel like that's just people trying to make themselves feel better because they don't feel like there's a lot they can do. Um, but I think that it's very hard because there's just so many people that if you just see, like, your perception of the world can be completely skewed by social media because you only see one thing or you don't see another thing. So like if you watch the news, you'll see a lot more riots, but if you go on Twitter, you'll see a lot more police brutality. And so it's like, oh, what's the truth here? You know?
Mhm. So, what do you have any suggestions for what maybe people should do instead of just posting about it on social media? Do you think that there are alternate methods to show support without actually like posting on social media saying, okay, hashtag
Yeah.
Blackout Tuesday? Yeah, but
Yeah. So like, I mean, I guess educating yourself. So I actually like a lot of people believe things without doing any research. And even if I like agree with what they're saying, I think they should do a bit of research on it. So like just taking your time to research something or look at statistics um can is better because then you get like a better understanding of the world around you, and you could also communicate with local government and talk to them and see what they think, because I'm sure talking to a police officer you get a very different story. um which, I mean, all those are that's a lot of work, but the thing is, if you want change, you need to put in the work. And I think that's what people fear. They just think that, oh, I just save myself some time by posting a black square. um yeah.
all right, so moving on, most of the protests that have been happening are really peaceful protests until the police arrive. And so we've seen large crowds be completely tear gassed when there's no signs of violence during the protest. And police are even making arrests to encourage protesters to move back and to even discourage them from continuing to protest. But this is on one side of a spectrum, and then you see on a completely different side of the spectrum, you see police officers that are kneeling with protesters, showing their support during these times. And so, what are your thoughts on this divide between there's like two completely different sides of there's groups of police officers enforcing, and then there's groups of police officers actually kneeling with the protesters?
The geographical impact, on politics is very large. And so you'll have different regions, they'll think different things. And the thing is, once a couple cops start kneeling, all the rest do. Once a couple cops get violent, all the rest do, because they act like a mob the same way the protesters do. Once a couple start looting, they all start looting. Even though some
Mhm.
try to prevent that, but I think it's really the group mentality. And I mean, I really think that that riot police should be a separate thing from regular police, because right now they do that sometimes, but it's mostly regular police, getting into gear and going out. And I think it takes a very different person to handle that frustration and anger, out in the
Hmm.
protests and the riots and such.
Okay. Um, and so what are your thoughts on using, let's say, force on protests? So, again, as I mentioned, right, police are throwing tear gas into crowds. And so do you think that's even like a humane way of acting with protests, like trying to diminish protests by throwing tear gas, or do you think there is a more peaceful option that could be opted for by police departments and by like the riot police you're mentioning? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the biggest incident of this was in Washington D.C. in the park in front of the White House,
Mm-hmm.
which has historically been a place where people protest every single day for like 100 years. And in that park, there was a protest, and it was before a curfew hadn't started yet. And a lot of those cases of tear gas on peaceful protesters during curfew is like after curfew. I mean, I don't think there should be curfews, but that's why they do it. And in the DC case, it was before curfew. And it turned out that like you'll see videos like there's one of the Australian reporters getting hit with shields and beaten, and it was really horrible.
Yeah.
And they just rushed in, and they didn't give any warning. They just came in through the tear gas, and that was done not by the DC police. And even though the DC isn't a state, they have their own similar state-like police, which is the DC police. It wasn't done by them. It was done by federal agents. So people actually ordered by Trump, or at least his administration, to go in and get people out. And it was for him to walk down through that park for like a promotional video on their Twitter,
Oh yeah.
which is that's. I mean, I'm not a very big like Trump hater, like criticizing him for eating chicken tenders with a fork, but like I think that was pretty like authoritarian. I didn't really like that. And I think that he's trying to make a show of power,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's good. I think you're just scaring people, making people more angry, you know.
Yeah. Okay. And so, what types of changes would you like to see happen in response to all these protests, all the movements, all the situations that have happened in the past 2 weeks? Would you expect this type of change, like this first type of change to come out of this, be more political or more of a social change? And do you think that us as a society are capable of handling such a change that would come, whether it be political or social?
Um, with handling it, I mean, and people want it so much. I think they want to handle it. They want change so much. But I see a lot of, especially on social media, I see people saying defund the police, which is a horrible idea because uh, if they just have less money, then they're more poorly trained. They have less access to tasers, beanbag guns, less than lethal options. And it just makes situations more dangerous because worse trained police officers will make more mistakes. You'll know they'll give conflicting commands to someone that will get them killed. They'll give they won't announce police when they enter a house, which would get people killed because they like pull a gun on someone because it's some random person running into their house. Which that has happened. Both those things have happened where multiple orders have led to a death, and so I think the defund police thing is not a good idea. A change, I guess, I would like to see is more of a standardized uh, police training system. So, um,
By
not
standard, you mean like
necessarily.
all across the globe, like a standard like all across the globe, or just
Oh, between states,
Oh, okay.
because I think that it should be not necessarily every police officer is trained the same way, but there are guidelines for how you train police officers because states need to keep their state rights, and more rural areas will have should have different training than urban areas. And I guess more like if you're in like Texas, there's gonna be more open carry people, so you know how to deal with them. So there are geographical differences, but the point of it would be that people know what police will do, so they'll know what to do around police. Oh, put your hands on the steering wheel, or like do what they say. That they might not know because they see other police in other areas doing different things, and it can be a bit confusing. Um, and I guess another change that could be made would be, as I said before, separating riot police from regular police. Um, uh, yeah, I think, but it's a very hard thing to quantify statistically, and I guess more clarity and more communication, more trust between police officers and people will be better for the officers and the people.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, last question for you. What message would you like the listener to leave with after listening to this? Do you have a overarching message you want to spread, or just anything you want to say?
Um, I guess don't believe everything you see like online. Like look into statistics, look into full stories. Don't let biases build up in your mind from anecdotes you see on TV and such, and just look at things more objectively when it comes to serious issues like this. When like emotions can overtake you.
All right. Thank you, Klaus, for coming on to Open Floor. It was a very nice discussion. And so I hope people will listen to this, and hopefully some of our listeners will be delighted to hear the ideas that you've shared. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
So that was my interview with Klaus. And Klaus brings up very valid points during his discussion. And I think he brings up a lot of good points in areas of, in more statistical areas, where he brings up a lot of good information regarding events that have happened before and their relation towards the events that have happened now, and how we have got up to this point. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and go on to a more historical approach towards this discussion. And so let's go to my interview with Aryan Narayan, where he takes on a more classical and historical approach on answering the questions I present to him in the interview. I'm here with Lexington High School student sophomore Aryan Narayan. Hi, Aryan.
Hi, Ali. How are you doing?
Good. How about yourself?
Doing pretty well, thank you.
Good. So you're no doubt aware of the recent death of George Floyd and the recent events that have happened over the past 2 weeks, which broke out protests and riots to happen all across the United States. And so my first question for you is, what are your emotions towards the protests and movements in the United States right now?
I can't help but feel anger towards the current situation because there's people that don't recognize the truth of what's going on and how it's a systemic issue that goes beyond just one officer killing one person. Because if you look back through our recent history in the past few years, you have examples like Tamar Rice, you have Philando Castile, you have Jamar Clark. I could name so many. And even if you look at some statistics, you can see that some races, some ethnicities are disproportionately affected by police brutality and in general being imprisoned or taken aside by the police. So I'm angry that people don't recognize this issue. And I also can't help but feel some sorrow because an innocent man just lost his life.
I understand your feelings. And so, how have these protests affected you on a more personal level?
If this was a more normal time without a global pandemic happening and all, with
Mhm.
extreme infectivity, I would have gone to these protests because I feel very strongly about these kinds of issues, especially living in a more progressive town, we have a bunch of these protests.
Mhm.
But with the current situation, I can't exactly go to these protests. So I do my best to uh, do my own research, get knowledgeable about these topics, and otherwise support the movement because that's all I can do right now. But I'm happy to do what I can and try and better this country.
Most definitely. And so, do you think that the current situation of COVID-19, do you think that that has an effect on the movements? Do you think that it's dampening the effects that the protests could have done if it wasn't during the time of COVID-19?
Oh, for sure, because the meaning, the purpose of these protests being undermined by people who say you're being so selfish. You're going outside, you're doing group gatherings during a pandemic, you're letting the virus spread. And that's all true, but people have to understand this wouldn't be happening if this wasn't a matter of some urgency. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
if you like look back at history, as I said, like racial discrimination has been such a huge theme throughout the history of this country, and I believe that George Floyd's death kind of like served as a spark to ignite these tensions, and that created protests. And I think it's a coincidence that it's happening at a time where we have a pandemic. But yeah, I think that the current situation is dampening the movement.
Okay, now onto a more historical side. And so, how do you think? Because, as you said before, there have been so many events of these of police brutality happening, not just in this year, but in you can go as far as 1995 and even pre 1995, and with the civil rights movement. And so, how do you think police brutality has evolved over time in this country, or if you want to comment also on how it has affected on a more global scale, how it has evolved
You
on a
know,
more global scale?
I'm not so knowledgeable about how it's evolved globally, but I think that if you look back on the history of the police in the United States, you'll see that it has a basis in racially charged, racist um, proceedings. Like the police, well, law enforcement in general, were involved with slavery and like returning slaves to
Mm-hmm.
their owners. Like I'm sure if you recall what we've learned in class, um, slaves that ran away from their owners, particularly in the South, bounties were put forward for them, and the police were the people who were responsible for bringing these slaves back to their owners. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that legacy of serving as a tool of subjugation has kind of stuck with the police. Like if you look over time, technically, there hasn't like in the current day there hasn't been any law. There isn't any law stating that black people should be incarcerated more than white people or Latino people more than white people, anything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the statistics, you'll see that in our incarcerated populations in U.S. prisons, um, there's a disproportionate amount of black people. There's a disproportionate amount of Latino people in our prisons, and I think that just goes to show that police are very biased towards who they approach, who they decide to arrest, and that also connects a bit to the criminal justice system, which is also biased.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you say that police brutality, you ask how it's evolved, and I think the one mainstay of police brutality is that it's been racially based, quite clearly, in fact. But I think the evolution has been in how explicit it is, how clear it is that it's race based. Like
Mm-hmm.
back in the days in the 19th century, with slavery still legal until 1865, um, uh, you'll see like quite explicitly like black slave for capture, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But uh, nowadays, there's nobody explicitly saying that black people need to be the subject of more police brutality. but it still happens. So I think that's more of an implicit bias thing kind of happening there. That's a issue with the system.
Yeah, very good. Okay, now more on the societal aspect of the protests that have been happening. So, I don't know if you are aware, but on social media, people have been posting about their support to the Black Lives Matter movements, and so this includes on Tuesday of last week, people were posting little black squares on Instagram and Facebook with the hashtag Blackout Tuesday, kind of showing their support to these movements. And so I wanted to know your thoughts on how useful do you think these actions are in the pursuit that we have to change a system?
I'm not really quite sure how I feel about the whole Blackout Tuesday idea, like posting black squares on Instagram, because I think it's a good movement on its surface because it's like a bunch of people supporting the movement, and it's a show of solidarity. But I think the issue with it is that people are treating it as a trend. And I'm not so sure that's the best thing for this movement because people who may or may not have the best interests of the movement at heart, they post these black squares, but is it for a trend or is it to actually support the movement? That's the question for me. And I think that um, this whole Blackout Tuesday idea uh, isn't that uh, isn't creating that much change. Now, I think the people on social media who are doing other things to support Black Lives Matter, like posting useful links, soliciting donations for the movements, things like that, those things are very useful, and I definitely support those. But the whole Blackout Tuesday idea with posting the squares, I'm not so sure if I support that yet. And there's also a CNN article that was talking about how the blackout squares, they clog up our systems of information because on Instagram, on Facebook, you search for information using tags. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if these black squares and other like supportive content, let's say, is tagged with these kinds of things, the people looking for information on police brutality, on protests, they won't be able to find them. They'll be scrolling through endless pages of black squares. At least that's what I've seen online.
Yeah. So yes, you bring up very good points, and I want the listener to know that these links that Aryan talked about, I will include a list of them in the description of this episode, and hopefully that they will provide to be a resource for you, the listener. Now back to the questions. Most of the protests that have been happening are very peaceful until the police arrive. And so we've seen large crowds being tear gassed, one example being in Washington, D.C., where there are no signs of violence. And police are even making arrests to encourage protesters to move back. And so this is one side of a spectrum, while on another side of a spectrum, you see police officers kneeling with the protesters. And so I want to know your thoughts on this divide between how you have, let's say, good cops and bad cops. Maybe that's a way to identify this.
Yeah, I would first like to pose a question to you, which is tear gassing is actually illegal in international warfare. Why do you think that the police force is allowed to use it on the U.S.'s own civilians? You don't have to answer that. It's kind of rhetorical, but it's an interesting question. Why can we treat our own citizens, our own country's residents, with such inhumane force when we won't even treat our enemies with the same kind of destructive technology? It raises an interesting point because the police are supposed to protect our civilians. They're supposed to stand with them. They're supposed to observe the peace. But what we've been seeing in these protests, at least in many examples, it's the police that are instigating the issues here. And that's who's instigating the violent protesting and the fighting back against the police. And I definitely do not support that. The use of violence by the police against peaceful protests is not called for at all.
Mhm.
And I think it puts a bad name on the police force as a whole. Now, as you mentioned, there are some good cops, uh, quote unquote good cops, and they stand with the protesters. They agree with the movement. They know that there's something wrong with their system, and well, I support them too. But that divide really shows that there's a massive issue in the police force across the country, and that issue needs to be solved before the police force can be effective. At least that's my view on it.
Mhm. And so, continuing that thought, what changes would you like to see happen in response to all the protests happening? And then, would you expect these first changes that are going to come out of this to be more of of political changes or societal changes? And do you think we as a society are ready to accept any changes that do come out of these movements and protests?
Now, when it comes to political and social changes, I think that political changes will come first because society is traditionally very slow to move forward as a whole, that is.
Hmm.
Perhaps the progressive and liberal parts of society will move faster towards these societal changes than the conservative sides. And that's why I think that political changes will come first because the government will certainly be pressured to enact changes on a local and on a state and on a federal level with regards to police forces.
Hmm.
Now, in regards to what changes I want to see, well, I would not go as far as abolishing the police as some people have suggested,
Hmm.
but I would look into other solutions. I would look into uh, creating some sort of independent body that investigates the police. Because as of right now, when the police are involved with incidents such as what happened with George Floyd and countless others, they are very closely involved with their own criminal justice system. So it's very hard to convict them.
Hmm.
And I'd like to see an independent body that does investigations and collects their own evidence with regards to the police, because
Hmm.
then you won't have that same bias and those same like connections that cloud the ability of justice to work on the police, because the police are not above the law. They're like any other citizen of this country.
Hmm.
And some other changes I want to see are concerted efforts to mitigate the effects of racial bias, because I personally think that racial bias will not be leaving anytime soon, but there has to be efforts to mitigate these effects. I
Hmm.
also want to see police being trained more in de-escalation, because many of these situations, uh, the people that they've arrested or attempted to arrest have been cooperating very peacefully with them. Maybe, uh, maybe not cooperating so much at times, but it's not required an officer to pull weapons or especially use them. So I want to see police being trained in how to de-escalate violent or potentially violent situations, so that they won't have to use their weapons, and so that they won't have to um, use force, and that would just lead to more death. So
Hmm.
de-escalation, I think, is very important as well.
Hmm. I think there are a lot of people out there that can agree with your changes, that agree with your ideas of change, and I do hope that we reach a point where these changes can occur. And so, before you go, my last question for you is: do you have a message that you want to leave for the listener? If the listener wanted to take one thing away from this interview, what would you want them to take away from this interview?
Yeah, so my message isn't exactly specific to police brutality, but it's more general, but it definitely still applies to police brutality. And that's to collect your own information independently of others. So, especially right now, we're in an age of misinformation and disinformation, where people who want to advance their own agendas spread their own information, whether it
Hmm.
be biased, cherry-picked, or just completely false. So I would advise any person listening to this to independently look through reliable factual sources to collect their information and form independent opinions, so that people who may seek to affect how they think for their own reasons can not have less effect on the opinions of the populations. And I think with a more well-informed population, societal change in a positive direction is more possible.
All right. So thank you, Aryan, for coming onto the podcast. This was a very informative discussion, as I hope it will be informative for the listener as well. But thank you again for coming.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Both the discussions I had with Klaus and Aryan brought to light some very key points, but it also brought to light important emotions. And I think it's crucial to know that to better understand an event that has happened, we should first go in the pursuit of the true emotions of the citizens that had to go through these events. Now, although the people I interviewed may not have direct influences in the movements, they are still bystanders. They are still people that are looking onto these movements, and they are able to still provide emotions that can help us better understand how people are feeling during this very complicated time. However, with that, I conclude this first episode of Open Floor. Thank you for joining me. All the links that I said during Aryan's interview will be in the description of this podcast, so make sure you check that out. The next episode will be a part 2 to this episode, and hopefully in a more discussion type format. However, I appreciate you joining me, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Open Floor. I want to thank our wonderful producer, Amin Pulgol Muhammad, for producing this episode. Go to our website at openfloor.me/home to sign up for email updates for new episodes, and visit us on Instagram at Open Floor Podcast. I'm Ali Musallay, and I'll see you in the next episode.